Okay, we're starting to get the attendees are coming in here. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jim McCafferty. I am an associate professor of criminal justice at Kennesaw State University. I'm also a CrimCon board member, and I'd like to welcome you to stream number 1, the Friday 3 p.m. section titled Gender and Justice. This is part 1. There'll be another panel next on that. We have 4 great panelists here today. We're going to go in the order of the program. Before I invite the first person up to begin, I'd like to just talk to the attendees very quickly that we're going to be hopefully having some time for question and answer at the very end. And if you'd like to ask a question of any of our panelists, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Simply click on that and ask a question, and I'll be tracking that as we go through this panel. And hopefully we'll have some time left at the end to do that. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Michelle up and give her the floor and let her give the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. CrimCon has been amazing, so thank you so much. I am just going to share my screen. Okay. So my name is Michelle Lyttle Storrod. I am a PhD candidate at Rutgers Camden. And I'm going to be presenting to you today about girls' pathways to the juvenile justice system. So this research was completed for my dissertation research for my PhD within the last year. And it looked at, the broader study looked at the role of phones and social media in the criminalization and victimization of girls in the juvenile justice system. It took place in a northeastern US city. And this work is inspired by feminist criminology pathways, which seek to contextualize young girls' entrance into the juvenile justice system, in particular, making people aware that victimization is often part of that very gendered pathway. It also is inspired by the human factor in cybercrime, which seeks to look at the perpetrators or offenders, victims, and the people responding to cybercrime. So far, juvenile justice has looked at digital crimes or cyber crimes of young people in regards to sexting and also primarily internet banging. So violence that is or is not caused by taunts on social media, for example. So this study contributes something new to pathways research, but also looks at more specifically at how these digital crimes and digital kind of revolution has impacted girls' entrance to the juvenile justice system. So this approach that I take is also founded by, has a foundation of digital ecology. So the argument here is that no understanding of a young person is complete anymore unless we include some kind of techno subsystem or digital ecology. So here this graphic shows that the digital ecology is based within the microsystem. However, my work would argue that actually extends across the social system. So for this research, I did focus groups with 31 girls and 6 groups. I conducted a series of interviews with 11 girls, which means that I spoke to these girls every couple of weeks or every month and over 6 months, and they filled me in on what was happening of the drama of social media or what was happening with their phones or just their lives in general. I did participant observation in meetings that were talking about girls and juvenile justice, and I also interviewed 22 practitioners. As part of this research, I also took part in virtual tours with the girls, where they would show me snapshots of their phones. It was important to me that the girls had complete control over their data, so I did not look at any social media or phone data without them present. They literally sat with me and showed me their phone, so volunteered their phone to me. The participants, the categories you see here were decided by the girls. The participants reflect the demographics of the city. The average age of the girls were 15 years old. and African American girls are overrepresented within this sample as they are in the juvenile justice system as a whole. So what are the digital pathways to juvenile justice? Well, the biggest two pathways, perhaps unsurprisingly, are simple assault, aggravated assault, and sexting. So in terms of simple assault, what we're talking about is filmed fights. Fights that the girls have been involved in that have been filmed and somehow found their way to the police or the juvenile justice system. So 100% of the girls had a fight on their phone that they had been involved in that had been filmed. This isn't necessarily what took them into the juvenile justice system, as many of them had been involved in juvenile justice for so long they couldn't remember their first offence. And sexting was also the second popular offence. So in addition to this, we have terroristic threats, which is how the court interpreted cyberbullying that was happening online, financial cyber scams, and technology facilitated drug dealing. I'm going to focus primarily on fighting and sexting here, but I want to first explain that what is new and different about these crimes is that they can come to the juvenile justice system or to the police or to the schools, as many of them were brought in through the schools at any time. So the girls could have been involved in a fight 2 years ago. They could have sent an indecent image or a naked image 3 years ago, and this could pop up at any time and bring them into the system, which is particularly difficult for those on probation, as they thought that they were getting towards the end of their probation and then something that is digital could occur or could reoccur. So responses to the two most frequent crimes that I saw, simple assault and sexting, are interested in terms of the contextualization of the court responses. So for simple assault and aggravated assaults, the filmed fight wasn't taken, the context of the filmed fight was not really addressed. So what this means is that it didn't matter where the fight started from, how it started, or if one person seemed to be being victimized or had been bullied for a long time and it culminated in a fight. All of the girls involved in the fight were taken to the juvenile justice system. And in particular, when schools brought these fights to the attention of the juvenile justice system or police, they were treated more harshly. So not only were they kicked out of school, they were also charged for these assaults. So whilst I was doing this study, the simple assault rates were rocketing, and they were seeing up to 50% more simple assaults, which were all connected to filmed fights. Sexting was interesting in terms of looking at the demographics of the girls, because the sexting, many of the girls were diverted out of the system. In particular, middle-class girls were diverted out. However, girls who were already in the juvenile justice system or were on the outskirts or concerned or seen as at risk of juvenile justice involvement, this was something that brought them in. And in particular, if they were socially disadvantaged girls, and within this sample, if they were Latinx girls, then the response by the juvenile justice system was harsher. Again, the context of the sexting wasn't taken into consideration, so there was no awareness of how the image was created, under what circumstances the image was created, and there was no kind of category for consensual sexting either. Interestingly, the response for these sexting and simple assault are also alternative. So in terms of the simple assault, it was not assumed that a filmed fight would be a gateway into further violence, even though it often was. If you had one filmed fight, you were more likely to have more filmed fights in the future because of the way that violence operated within the communities. However, the juvenile justice system didn't respond to a filmed fight as a gateway to further violence. However, sexting was seen as a gateway into sex trafficking, even though there was a lack of evidence of this. Again, if we go back to the demographics of the young people, it was seen that the girls who experienced the most inequality were seen as those who were at most risk of sex trafficking as a result of sexting. So what is keeping the girls in the system? Violation of probation and risk of sex trafficking. So linked to what I just said in terms of sex trafficking and how it was viewed, the young people who were living in poorer areas were consistently seen as at risk of sex trafficking, even though there wasn't any other indicators of this. And often they would violate probation through running away, and this would be also digitally facilitated.
Sorry to interrupt, you have 2 minutes to go.
Okay, so young people knew this and knew that that the running away was often linked to social media and phones, and the practitioners saw phones as evil, as something that was making their job impossible because the girls could abscond by ordering an Uber or contacting sex traffickers via their phone. Again, there was a lack of evidence to support this. So the response of juvenile justice, the digital intervention, there wasn't digital intervention apart from phone removal and internet removal. And this was for any crime that was being committed by the girls. It didn't have to be digitally facilitated in any way, but primarily one of the things that was used to try and combat girls entering the system or further involvement in crime was the removal of their phone and internet, which is part of a forthcoming paper. I believe I am at my time. Thank you very much for listening. If you would like more details about this, you can contact me on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I appreciate it. All right, our next presentation is from Amy. Michelle, if you would unshare your screen so we can let Amy do that.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Amy Stearns. I am an assistant professor of criminal justice at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, screen sharing. Okay. I am presenting today on behalf of myself and my co-researcher, Casey Albritton. The title of our presentation is Recipes to Kill For: Gendered Narratives of Crime and Desistance in Prison Cookbooks. That title, Recipes to Kill For, comes from a recipe in a prison cookbook named Oatmeal to Kill For. It was so good that the individual continued to prepare this long after his release from prison. So why prison cookbooks? Prison cookbooks are a rich source of narrative that can broaden our understanding of the gendered incarceration experience, yet are overlooked in scholarship. Research on prison foodways has historically prioritized interviews and ethnographies, leaving offenders' own writings, such as the prison cookbook, as a largely ignored form of narrative. A prison cookbook, broadly defined, is a collection of recipes that can be made in one's own cell. In other words, these are recipes for in-cell cooking, sometimes allowed by the institution, sometimes disallowed. Ingredients are obtained by saving leftovers from meals, smuggling items from the prison kitchen, buying items in an underground market, purchasing things from commissary, or if you're very lucky, having a loved one at home mail you the ingredients that you need for your recipes. This type of cooking, as you can imagine, is quite unconventional. So trash bags are used for mixing bowls. Your prison ID card is used as a knife for cutting and chopping ingredients, and hair dryers provide oven temperature heat. Here's a picture of a few of my prison cookbooks that I examine along with my cat. Cookbook narratives construct identity and reveal discursive strategies. Scholarship outside of criminology on gendered narratives in popular, mass market, and celebrity cookbooks, such as books from The Pioneer Woman and Jamie Oliver, for example, suggests that foodways discourse creates gendered identities. Cookbook rhetoric has been found to construct women as bodies who perform physical and emotional care for others, and emphasizes smallness, weakness, and politeness. All these are characteristics of emphasized femininity or an ideal woman. Cookbook rhetoric has also been found to construct men as large bodies, appropriating cooking spaces through strength and force, and approaching cooking as a leisure activity rather than as a domestic duty. These are all tenets of a concept called hegemonic masculinity, an ideal man. Both emphasize femininity and hegemonic masculinity as conceptualized by Connell in 1987, are largely unattainable ideals. Yet our culture tends to align gendered bodies along these tenets, and specifically for men, assigns power to those who reflect these characteristics. We approached the prison cookbooks with a narrative criminology perspective. This is an emerging perspective that considers an offender's own narrative as a legitimate and valid form of knowledge. Narrative criminology examines offenders' own words to identify discourses of crime and harm and desistance from crime and harm. Okay, so the big so what for this project and for studying prison textbooks as a whole. There are two reasons the language of prison cookbooks matter and why we study these texts. Reason number one, discursive strategies in all texts are important because language has the power to reproduce and reinforce pervasive tropes about gender that play into historical social inequalities between men and women. Cookbooks are significant in reproducing and reifying gender norms and the gender dichotomy. Reason number two, gender discourses in prison cookbooks can better inform us as to how offenders conceptualize themselves within stories of crime and harm. For example, do their stories narrate them as continuing in crime or narrating them as desisting from crime and harm? We had two research questions that guided our study. Research question number one, how is gender discursively constructed through prison cookbook narratives? And research question number two, do these gendered narratives convey stories of crime or stories of desistance from crime? We used critical discourse analysis to examine 22 prison cookbooks. 18 were male-authored and 4 were female-authored cookbooks. Critical discourse analysis sees language as a social practice that reinforces dominant ideologies. We independently read each text, coded gendered rhetoric, and utilized extensive memoing in an iterative process. And we met to compare notes regularly. After having reached consensus on gendered rhetoric patterns, we then moved forward with the analysis to code for narratives of crime and narratives of desistance within the gendered rhetoric. We found 6 masculinity discourses within the male-authored cookbooks and 4 femininity discourses within the female-authored cookbooks. We found more rhetoric of crime and harm among the male-authored cookbooks and more rhetoric of desistance from crime and harm among the female-authored cookbooks. Among the 18 male-authored prison cookbooks, we found the following 6 discourses that all aligned with hegemonic masculinity. They were rule-breaking and risk, size and strength, force and violence, messiness and disgust, compulsory heterosexuality, and sports and working out. Of these discourses, 3 of them constructed men as continuing to engage in the types of harmful or criminalized behavior that may have led to their incarceration. These were rule-breaking and risk, force and violence, and compulsory heterosexuality. Not that compulsory heterosexuality in itself is criminalized behavior, but this rhetoric was embedded in narratives about risk-taking, rule-breaking, and sometimes even violence. So for example, this is a male-authored cookbook called Commissary Kitchen. The author stated that those who had sex with female correctional officers could reap the benefits because they'll sneak all kinds of stuff over to you, extra food, whatever. This quote is reflective of several concepts. Because it is illegal to have sexual relations with prisoners, this quote is illustrative of risk-taking within compulsory heterosexuality, a risk that could bring with it further sanctions and further criminalization. Among the 4 female-authored prison cookbooks, we found patterns of discourse reflecting emphasized femininity, helping, sharing, and cooperation, cleanliness, morality and religion, and women's weak bodies. The rhetorical strategies used by all four of these discourses constructed women as desisting from or distant from crime. They all supported emphasized femininity, a practice that is culturally located in opposition to criminalized behavior.
Amy, I'm sorry to interrupt. You have 2 minutes to go.
2 minutes, thank you. And largely established the women as pro-social, non-criminalized bodies. Here is an example from a female-authored prison cookbook called Stinging for Their Suppers. You can see that the author is writing about sharing food that was sent from home, sharing commissary purchases so that they could make their meals together. This quote is reflective of the rhetoric in women's prison cookbooks that centered community, sharing, and cooperation. See the difference between the way the commissary kitchen author suggests obtaining ingredients and how the Stinging for Their Suppers author suggests obtaining ingredients. One is risky and situates the author amid crime and harm. The other creates narrative distance from crime. So, results. Individuals who write prison cookbooks rhetorically situate themselves as normative gendered bodies, adopting discourses that establish the self within the boundaries of hegemonic masculinity and emphasize femininity. This aligns with research on the gender discourse of traditional and celebrity and mass market cookbooks. We found more stories of crime among men's cookbooks embedded within their gendered rhetoric. The takeaway. Prison cookbook language serves to further reify traditional gender roles. It's important to note that incarcerated individuals may rely upon traditional gender roles to successfully navigate or even physically survive prison life. Particularly for men, embracing hegemonic masculinity within the context of prison cooking may lead to further criminalization. But increased access to recipe ingredients and sanctioning of in-cell cooking may mitigate this. Thank you so much. Oh, here's my Twitter handle.
Thank you, Amy.
Yep.
I appreciate that. I never thought about prison cookbooks before. That was definitely very interesting. Thank you so much. Okay, Maria. Oops. I think you're on mute, Maria. And Amy, you may have to unshare your screen here. Whoop. Okay. Maria, are you able to share your screen now?
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria. I'm a PhD candidate at Florida International University, and today I just wanted to discuss my dissertation that I started this semester entitled Gender in the Courtroom, Does Chivalry Supersede the Courtroom Hierarchy? So until this point, most of my research has focused on racial and ethnic disparities, but I found it interesting that there was a pretty significant gap in gender and criminal justice outcomes research. There are a lot of mixed findings about the differences in outcomes for men and women. For example, some studies find that men are treated more harshly than women, while others find that women are punished more severely than men. Recently, other studies have found that there's no association between gender and outcomes, or a very weak association when accounting for criminal history or offense severity, or taking into account the interaction of gender and race. So again, a lot of these studies lead to mixed results, and this is also partially due to limited data, which this dissertation will address. And also, I think one of the themes that I've come across while reading literature is that the theoretical perspectives are also contradictory. So for example, you have this camp where researchers find that the more lenient treatment of women, which would be, the chivalry hypothesis, in which judges are giving deference to women, or, informal social control, in which women are handled or, sort of controlled in more private spaces instead of through formal sanctions. Whereas there are others who argue that women are treated more harshly because of, the evil women thesis, in which women are who commit crimes are so dangerous that they need to be removed from society, or paternalism, in which, judges are seeking maybe to protect dependents or the spouse, the family, from a woman who commits crime. So they're giving her maybe a longer sentence. So again, these theories are conflicting, and so I kind of wanted to look outside of criminal justice for a theory to anchor this dissertation to. So I found that representative bureaucracy was an interesting take. Representative bureaucracy contends that demographically diverse organizations are better equipped to address the needs of their communities. So, a more monolithic organization won't be as equipped to, address the needs of the community, whether it's, law enforcement or education. This has been used in a variety of contexts. It's been used once in terms of the courts, in which, female prosecutors might respond differently to cases involving female victims. So again, this graphic just shows that, either the mere presence of marginalized groups within organizations or those organizations using their discretion to aid marginalized groups can affect outcomes. So I wanted to include multiple decision points for this study. So I'll be looking at the initial charging decision, which is under the purview of the prosecutor. Also any charge changes, again, that's under the purview of the prosecutor, and plea dispositions, and then final sentences. And in order to test this theory, I have detailed prosecutor and judge and defendant information. Some of those I had to generate on my own through my own research and add it to the existing data set. I also have prior record and offense severity. And then victim variables when applicable, because again, if there are specific offenses involving female victims or crimes that typically involve female victims like sexual assault or domestic violence, then, that is also something that might come into play here. So the data set used for this study is gathered as part of a larger grant-funded project that studies various facets of prosecutorial discretion, or prosecution in general, including discretion, efficiency, fairness, the office's data collection capacity, and their overall transparency with the public. And specifically, the office that I'll be looking at is a mid-sized Florida jurisdiction. The larger project has partnerships with offices across the country, but for this specific study, I'll just be looking at one jurisdiction in Florida. And in order to analyze the data, I'll be using 3-level HLM. Here, defendants will be nested within prosecutors, and prosecutors will be nested within judges. In this jurisdiction, defendants are assigned to prosecutors by last name, and prosecutors are assigned to judges by division. So, there are certain felony divisions, misdemeanor divisions, that sort of thing. And the reason I'm doing this is because if I only accounted for prosecutor or judge variables, that could be problematic. For example, if you're wanting to examine test scores in certain schools and you only look at students nested within classrooms, you would be missing out on any school level or school-wide factors that affect test scores. And so again, my research questions are centered on these 4 decision points. So the first 2 are charging and charge changes. Those are largely predicated on the prosecutor, but as part of this larger grant-funded research, I had the opportunity to interview prosecutors, and they did state that while they have a lot of discretion at this particular decision point, they did take into account the judge they would be going in front of for this particular case. So that did affect their charging decisions, which was interesting. And also, again, I wanted to see if there were differences in rates of plea disposition for different gender categories. And also, again, the final sentence length was something that I did find interesting and wanted to examine here. And just for illustrative purposes, I created frequencies for the different gender triads to give you an idea of what the jurisdiction looks like. I created these using prosecutor and defendant gender that I already had, but the judge gender I had to generate, I only had their name in the data set. So I used online profiles of them with the Florida Bar, or the circuit had a website that might need to be updated, but they had gender information, so I was able to create that variable to then create this triad, and they're in the order of defendant, judge, and then the disposition prosecutor. So in this jurisdiction, you can see that the most common combination at 25% roughly is a male defendant, a male judge, and a female prosecutor, which, you know, knowing what we know about the incidences of females female defendants committing crimes, or female defendants being represented in the criminal justice system rather, that makes sense. And in this jurisdiction in particular, there are actually more female line attorneys than there are male line attorneys. So, you know, you have your typical, you know, male judge. They're overwhelmingly, the judiciary in this jurisdiction is male defendant, and then a female prosecutor, followed by an all-male gender triad. So the goals of this study, I think it's more, you know, I've just started this as, you know, my dissertation, and the goal of this study for me is to better explain any differences in outcomes for cases by gender. So I think there's still a lot of room for this field to grow, you know, accounting for judge, prosecutor, and hopefully down the road, maybe defense counsel and more detailed victim information, to better get a sense of how all these different actors come together and how maybe their genders, or, you know, another area of research is their race, come into play here.
Maria, I'm sorry to interrupt. You have 2 minutes to go.
And also, I just wanted to discuss how representative bureaucracy plays a role in criminal justice decisions, because I think it's an interesting perspective, and especially now where, you know, we're seeing a more representative or diverse judiciary, we're seeing more diverse legal profession in general. So I definitely am open to suggestions. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I appreciate that. And good luck with your dissertation work. I do not envy you at all. I don't miss dissertating one little bit. So,
thank you.
All right, thank you. We are going to give the floor to Darian now. Darian, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and let me know when you're ready to go, and I'll start your clock.
Alrighty. You can see my screen.
We can see your screen, correct?
Perfect.
There you go.
Alrighty. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Darian Hills. I'm at Kennesaw State University under the advisement of James McCafferty. This research is a part of my master's thesis, and the title is The Future is Female, an examination of officer-client communication of risk using the sample of justice-involved women. So a little bit of background. Researchers have begun to question whether crime solutions work equally for both male and female offenders. The research is proving that qualitative differences exist and may impede the process of offenders when they are treated poorly or not treated at all. Researchers have attributed the increase in justice-involved women to several factors. Some say that get tough laws and the war on drugs might be a reason, while others believe that the transition was an inevitable evolution due to arrest patterns and system-level politics. Findings are showing that gender-neutral treatments may not be an effective method for handling female offenders and may actually be detrimental to them. So criminologists have found that when female offenders enter the criminal justice system, they can be placed into 5 distinct categories. These categories are street women, battered women, harmed and harming women, drug-connected women, and economically motivated women. Each of these pathways highlight gender-specific adversities that have been found to affect justice-involved women at a significantly higher rate than males. These include childhood and adult victimization, substance abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, mental illness, and poverty. So you may be asking, what can be done? So there are a few solutions that have been found to be beneficial in the efforts to support justice-involved women. The first is quality relationships. According to a study by Scheme et al., the quality of the relationship between an officer and offender can predict desistance from crime as well as an offender's likelihood to participate in treatment. Consistent with the findings from Epperson et al., which found that characteristics such as warmth, empathy, and trustworthiness were important predictors for an offender's perception of a successful relationship with their officer. This correlation is best explained by Chamberlain et al., which found that the type of rapport that an offender and an officer have is directly reflected in the offender's recidivism rate. Another thing that should be done is acknowledging the dual role relationship. A significant barrier throughout the relationship literature is the balance that supervisory officers must maintain. Known as dual role relationship, officers may carry out authoritative actions while also having to fulfill the role of a social worker. And research is showing that given the option in the dual role, officers will choose to exercise authority, which puts the strain on their relationship with offenders. Finally, gender-specific and gender-focused treatments need to be enacted. More recently, criminologists have begun to pair risk-need responsivity models with gender-focused criminogenic needs and have found encouraging results. Gender-responsive treatments are a system that emphasizes the importance of the female experience and addresses the uniquely psychological, developmental, and social needs that lead female offenders to crime. The hope is that by implementing these three things, female offenders will feel better supported and have their needs met and desist from crime. So a little bit about our research. My thesis will be focusing on, oh my goodness, sorry. Okay, my thesis will be focusing on the officer-offender relationship, criminogenic needs, and how all of these components can affect an offender's recidivism. I'll be using secondary data collected by Marash, Smith, Cassie, and Kobina from their research, which is titled Probation and Parole Officers' Interaction with Women. The population is 73 supervisory officers working in both probation and parole, which were recruited by the researchers themselves. And also I'll be using 402 justice-involved women, which were recruited by the supervisory officers during an open recruitment session by the researchers and through word of mouth between the offenders. Marash et al. Used the Women's Risk and Needs Assessment as a basis for their questions and also used dual role relationship theory to form non-demographic research questions. Some data of interest for the officers. We'll be looking at demographic information, which will include education, level of training on the supervision of female offenders, and the amount of training received related to gender-specific offender needs. We will allow prior research to guide our research and focus on variables that relate to openness, authoritativeness, and the frequency of contact between the officer and the offender, as each of these variables have been found to be important when establishing a positive officer-offender relationship. We will also be interested in the officer's perceptions of their relationship with their female offenders. Some data related to the justice-involved women. We'll be looking at variables including demographics like ethnicity and age, as well as conviction type. The WRNA is an expansive assessment, but for the relevance of our study, we'll be looking at descriptive variables related to gender-specific needs. These will include financial stability, depression and anxiety, drug use, employment, experienced trauma, antisocial peers, and mental health. Prior research notes that women in corrections experience issues in all of these areas, which leaving them untreated will lead to recidivism. We will also be looking at follow-up questionnaires, which ask about the perceptions of the women's relationships with their supervising officers. These questions cover a range of information about met and unmet needs, including treatments, services, and resources, and have been proven to reduce the likelihood of recidivism. So what we're hoping to do is prove the establishment of a positive relationship between the officer and the offender and how it leads to desistance from crime. For our next steps, Dr. McCafferty and I will be concluding our study in early 2021, and I will be defending my thesis in the spring. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us either by email or Twitter, which you can see on the screen. And I would like to thank everybody for attending, and thank you to CRIMCon for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Darian. Great job. So let's see here. We don't have any questions from the audience, but we do have about 26 or so folks in there. So if you have any questions for our panelists, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Do any of the panelists have questions for one another? Darian has a question.
I'll go. I wanted to ask Amy how she got into looking at the cookbooks, because that is fascinating.
Let's see. I was volunteering at our local jail, and the warden said, our women have been making some just incredible recipes. Why don't you create a cookbook with them? So I spent about a year collecting recipes and making a cookbook for the jail, and it just got me interested. So I guess you can say I fell into it, and then I found that no one was examining these texts, which is always a great yay, no one is looking at these. So that's how that happened, and it was just fascinating. And boy, are these people resourceful. Just incredible things that they are able to make with ingredients that you wouldn't believe. Thank you for that question. I get that a lot.
Are there any other questions from the audience or the panelists? Okay, so I just want to thank the panelists for their presentations. All of them were interesting, and I appreciated all of the experts bringing their talents and time to CrimCon. We are a startup, as you know, and it's pretty neat to see all the engagement and all the great research that we've seen these last few days. The video from this panel will be up, I believe, by the end of the year, but it's COVID, so who knows? So maybe longer than that, but that is the goal and is the plan. I have to log out of this stream to log into a different stream for the next panel, but there will be one more panel here on gender on stream 1 that'll be hosted by Bree Beaupre in a few moments, or in a few minutes, I should say. So thank you to the panelists. I also appreciate the attendees as well for taking your time and coming out here. And Amy, you're the only person I've seen that got a shout out from one of their kids in the chat here. So that was pretty cool. So
special moment for me.
So I hope everybody enjoys themselves. I hope everybody is healthy and happy and enjoys their time.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.